My name is Ashley Plants, and I am the lead people scientist at Sapia.ai. I am very excited to be here with IO Guru and our Sapia advisor, Dr. Richard Landers. Just a little bit about me before we get started. Probably goes without saying, but my background is in IO Psych. I got my PhD from Bowling Green and have spent nearly the last 10 years in pre-hire selection and assessment. Like so many of us in the field, the majority of my career has been on traditional assessments, so things like personality tests, cognitive ability, situational judgment tests. But recently, I made the leap to AI-based assessments because I believe that AI is the future of hiring. Hiring with AI, when done right, ethical AI, can really drastically improve our ability to hire the best fit candidate, disrupt bias, and actually improve diversity. And I've seen us do that every single day. Coming to work for Sapia, I have had the pleasure to work very closely with the data science team, which really has helped me to learn so much, but has challenged me to really think about how things can be done sometimes done better, but still with scientific rigor and IO best practices. The combination of IO psychology and data science is a really powerful combination. But at the end of the day, that doesn't change the fact that sometimes we just speak different languages. So that really brings us to the motivation behind this webinar, which is really to bridge the gap between the traditional IO way of thinking with the new way of thinking with AI and AI-based assessments. Because let's be honest, AI is not just the future, it's here. It's here now. AI is all around us. Everyone is talking about it. There was even a South Park episode about ChatGPT, so you know it's mainstream if it's on South Park. But what does that mean for IO psychology and selection assessment in particular? So that brings us to why we're here, to hear from expert in the space and Sapia advisor, Richard. So Richard is the John P. Campbell Distinguished Professor of IO Psychology at the University of Minnesota. He is an elected member of the executive board of the Society of IO Psychology, and he's published extensively in the area of HR tech, including AI-based assessments. He's also the founder and president of Landers Workforce Science, where he advises clients on both the legal and practical side of building or implementing modern HR technologies, especially through psychological audits of technology using AI and machine learning. So that's enough for me. Welcome, Richard. We're really happy to have you. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
All right, so to start off with a quick level setting question, given assessments come in all shapes and sizes, what would you say makes an assessment AI based? Is it simply when there is a machine learning component? There's so many different varieties. What makes an assessment go from a quote traditional assessment to an actual AI based assessment?
Yeah, traditional is a fun way to contrast it. So there's a difference between what I think of as AI and what I think the market calls AI at this point. AI is a very old concept. So we've had AI for decades in active use. I mean, anybody that remembers having to give feedback to your email program on whether you're looking at spam or not is participating in AI-based systems. The ability to scan a document and get text out of it in a PDF is AI. Basically, anytime that we're replacing human functioning with something automated and algorithmic in nature, we're using AI. But that said, there is definitely a change that I think when people hear the word AI now, that they're reacting to, in that there are new data types and data formats and approaches to scoring those data that didn't well, they existed but weren't really feasible for mainstream use maybe 10, maybe even 5 years ago. And that's usually what people are thinking about. So we actually just recently had there was a webinar with SIOP and SHRM, the commissioner of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Keith Sunderling, spoke there. And you could tell from their discussion, like they went to a very specific subset of assessment types. They were talking about click and trace data. They were talking about game-based assessments. They were talking about asynchronous virtual interviews, and they were talking about social media scraping as kind of like the prototypes in the space. I think what really unites all of the approaches people are thinking about is this sort of novel data type interpretation, whether that's trace data in all of its forms. There's much more to trace data than clicks, but any sort of trace data, whether you're talking about language and text and speech, that kind of input into these models. And it's really that paying attention to these kind of new and unfamiliar data types that really unites discussion of AI. And that sometimes, but not always, necessitates machine learning. Sometimes the data that come in are so complex, machine learning is simply the only way to make sense of it. It's not necessarily true, but I would say most AI applications are going to involve some kind of machine learning most of the time.
All right, and then with this new way of looking at AI AO-based assessments, which really isn't that new, what advice would you give to IOs who are navigating and speaking the language with AI assessment vendors who maybe don't speak the same language as IO psychologists? There seems to be a disconnect there sometimes. How do you navigate that?
Yeah. So I mean, so this is the problem that some of it is new and some of it isn't, and that's a confusing space to navigate. So from the perspective of a lot of the more, I might call it like a hardcore data science vendor, the folks that are coming from the more pure technologist kind of perspective, they're often treating these concepts very differently than we are, and trying to bridge that gap it can be very challenging. A big part of that is actually the language itself. That when I ask for, coming from a psychology perspective, if I'm asking for what's the validity of your measure, then that's going to be interpreted very differently by someone coming from a machine learning background than what I meant. So, to any psychologist, you mentioned the word validity. They're like constructs, validations, standards, minimizing litigation risk through appropriate practice. Like, there's a huge body of things that occur just hearing that word. Whereas in the kind of algorithmic space, when you talk about validity, it's still about, does this thing do what I intended it to do, what I claim it to do? But that's focused more on how systems work. So when we say validity, what we really mean is when you say this measures leadership potential, does it really do that? When they hear validity, they're hearing, oh, does your algorithm do the thing that you claim it to do? And the thing that they claim their algorithms to do is predict something. So if you ask, what's the validity of your algorithm? Then the immediate response to that is, oh, we had a data set, we predicted our outcome in that data set really well. Done. End of discussion. So trying to communicate clearly and translate terms between those worlds is really the big challenge. I think that there's probably a better chance that IOs will learn to speak more of the data science lingo than the data scientists will learn to speak the IO lingo. So I generally encourage IOs to, and people in the HR space broadly, to try to actually gain expertise, at least enough to speak the same kind of language that they're speaking, so that when they say validity, you know what that means. When they say, oh, we're using supervised learning, that there's an immediate thought in your head. Whether you can do it or not is different. Like whether you could open up Python or whatever and start coding, that's not really relevant. But that when they use these words, that you're able to recognize, oh, that maps onto my understanding of validation studies in this way, and are able to kind of bridge that gap just in terms of the language that we're sharing.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that kind of brings to mind, something that, came out in the recent guidelines that, you, Chris, and I and team, put together around, how the standards are still the same. We're still expecting AI assessments to meet the same psychometric standards, but the way in which we assess for those things may vary. Can you talk a little bit about that? So, again, like when a data scientist hears validity, they might think one thing, so then how do you, what's an example of how you might have to shift the way of looking at something to identify, reliability, validity, things like that?
Sure. Yeah. Reliability is a good example. So when it's another of those words that has two different meanings. So in the data science space, reliability usually refers to consistency of an algorithm just working. So how reliable is the system you're using, in the sense of, is it always up? Can I always get predictions out of it? Is it consistently working? Versus consistency of measurement, the way we would talk about reliability. So So yeah, whenever you're in this space, what you're really saying is the underlying like philosophical question that reliability really is, which is how do you know that the thing you're measuring right now about this person, the thing you claim to be understanding, leadership or future job performance or whatever it is that you claim you're doing, how do you know that if I gave them the same assessment a week from now, that they would still have the same score? And that phrasing is a little more understandable to somebody that doesn't have the language of psychometrics, but at the same time appreciates that you are trying to make they're trying to make a claim about a human, and you're looking for some confidence that that means something in terms of the actual underlying human. So if that's a totally foreign concept, if you say, oh, you claim that they have engineering skill on the basis of this assessment that you gave, well, how do you, if I gave them this assessment like a month from now, would they still score the same on this thing? Like, would you tell me the same about their potential for engineering based on these 2 time points? And they should have some answer to that. And if they don't, then that means they're not even thinking of these sort of human elements in a way that suggests that they're going to be able to go a lot further than that. So yeah, I think it's really about deeply understanding the psychometrics concepts to say, reliability is about consistency, that numbers mean something. And validity is about, do the numbers represent the thing you think they represent and that you're saying they represent? And if you put it in those terms, then you help to bridge that gap a little bit. And at the very least, you communicate to them, hey, you should be thinking about this, and maybe in the future you'll have evidence like this, or maybe you'll talk to somebody about this, and maybe you'll create some evidence that helps show these things. That's the worst case scenario. And in the best case scenario, they say, oh, we don't call it that, but we actually have data that kind of speak to that, and here's what it is. So that's kind of the conversation you want to try to have.
Yeah, and having those conversations, with a data scientist that maybe speaks a different language, brings to mind, what questions should you be asking, when you're having those conversations, and, how do you ask them, what questions should you be asking around, determining that it's a good fit for your needs, that it's valid, unbiased, and fair, all those things that are super important to us. What questions should you be asking to help determine that they have all of those things?
Yeah, so the good news is that we have a lot of well-established systems already in place that explain kind of all the major dimensions of the questions that one should usually be asking about psychological measures, which is to say any time that a vendor is claiming we're measuring some characteristic of a person, there are certain standards of evidence required to support that argument. So we can go back, for example, to the standards of psychological measurement, which is essentially a consensus document written by the American Psychological Association, the National Council for Measurement Education, and the American Educational Research Association, APA, ERA, and CME are the 3 groups. So in that document, they basically create standards of validity evidence that you're looking for. So is the score correlated with things you expect it to be correlated to? Is there evidence that when people are taking the test that they're bringing up the processes and the cognitions that they're supposed to be based on the thing that you're claiming is being measured? These kind of standards still apply. So we can basically be asking like, hey, how do you know? How do you know that what you're claiming to be measured is in fact what you're claiming to be measured? And that's the first piece. That's that validity question. There's also the reliability question. Is there consistency? Have you ever measured the same people more than once in time? Like we would, as psychologists, immediately say, oh, do you have inter-rater or do you have test-retest reliability evidence? They're not going to know what that means. But you can say, oh, have you ever given this twice to people? That's a much more understandable question. Now, that said, the standards that we normally apply are only a piece of the puzzle. So one of the things that was really important to me and to a colleague of mine, Tara Barrand, we put together this list of auditing standards that we published in American Psychologist, I think just appeared this year. And we said, this is the starting point, these basic validity reliability questions. We also have some responsibility to dive into the more data science-y piece to say, well, where did your data come from? Why do you have it that way? Did you engage in practices likely to lead to an unbiased starting point? Like, is the data set that how do you know the data set that you're starting from is fair? How do you know what the quality of it is? And this should be an ongoing conversation that one can have when evaluating any AI vendor. They should have some body of evidence that they can point to and say, we have done our due diligence to investigate how this thing works and why. And if every answer that they give you is, well, every time we put it into our stress test predictive model, it works. And when we threw some additional data at it, it works. And they never go to that human level. They never say, oh, we tried to understand this in terms of the people taking the tests and what that means about them. Then that's a big red flag for me. Because that also implies to me that they might not be paying a whole lot of attention to a lot of the legal requirements and the ethics issues surrounding these things too. So yeah, I think it's a long-term conversation about all these dimensions. In the paper we split it up into three kind of buckets. That there's questions about the models themselves, the AI, machine learning components, whatever they are. Where did the data set come from? How did you figure out what to do with it? How did you develop it over time? How are you still observing it? What does it do, and how do you know what it's doing? On top of the question of the final predicted scores, like are they valid? Are they reliable? Do you have fairness evidence in the way that we would normally want to see it? We then also had a second bucket of saying, well, are your materials aligned with that? So how do you know that the messages you're giving job candidates, the messages you're giving hiring managers, and even the messages you're giving externally to me right now are in fact justified by the data that you have available? Like, what was your process? What expertise went into that? And then our third bucket are these sort of broader overarching issues of, well, how did you respect people's cultures and languages and all these sort of society level concerns associated with all the different ways you could have approached all of the things I just told you? How did you ensure high quality research designs? When you were looking at correlates, like what did you actually do? And is that something that I would trust based on my own understanding of good quality research and the standards that I would bring as an IO psychologist to that question? So I think having a conversation about all of those components, even better, asking for white papers or technical reports or just something documenting what they've done in relation to this set of questions, gives you a good idea of how responsible they feel for the conclusions that they're sharing and whether you should trust what they're telling you.
Yep, sure. Writing technical reports, everyone's favorite activity, but absolutely so important. It reminds me also of, there's an interpretation element there too that I'm hearing. Are they actually thinking about, what does this mean? What's, getting away from the black box, so to speak, so, instead of just, plugging numbers into an algorithm, having an output, and the output predicts something. So we're going to say it's important because it predicts something. Well, there's more to it than that. What is it? What is it that you're measuring? Is it reliable? All those things. So getting, taking a peek under the hood, so to speak, and really understanding, what it is that they did, can definitely understand, just how essential that is. So we did have some submitted questions that I think we have time for. One person asked or commented really that tech and engineering folks tend to see things as black and white. So for example, we either have 100% confidence that AI will work for X purpose or no confidence. But what are the gray areas that we're not talking about and maybe we should be talking about? They gave the example of job analysis. So maybe we feel confident using it for job analysis, but there may be elements of talent management where we don't feel as confident. So what are those gray areas where maybe it would be okay?
Yeah, well, I mean, the underlying concern there is why we see things in different ways in the first place. I actually just finished up and it will be published relatively soon a chapter in Tracy Kantrowitz's book, which is it's like an official PsyOp publication. But a chapter on basically why philosophically do IOs and technologists have different perspectives on things. And a lot of it comes from just the fact that our training is so different in terms of what we care about and what we pay attention to. So yeah, I actually wouldn't say that engineers tend to view things as black and white precisely. I would say that instead they tend to view any problem as a solvable problem if you can just figure out the right parameters for it and figure out what your inputs and outputs are and figure out what your tolerance for inaccuracy is. And at that point, regardless of all other factors, there is some way to get the best quality product possible out of that thing. Whereas in IO, I think we're more inclined to say, well, humans are fuzzy and complicated and difficult to understand. And sometimes there's just not very good signal in the noise. And that's just how it is. So I think that impression is a little bit of a philosophical difference in orientations. But that, impressing on your more engineering minded folks that ambiguity exists and is okay, and that there are standards that we bring to those conversations that are essentially non-negotiable is an important part of trying to have that conversation. So one of the examples actually I use in the chapter is what you definitely don't want to happen as like a developer of these kind of tests, to give folks kind of an insight into what this is like on the other side. What you don't want to have is for IOs to have concerns and then the engineers to say, the IOs don't know what they're talking about, so we're just going to do whatever and not tell them, which I've seen happen in some places. It's very, very bad. So having conversations with vendors, this is part of what you're feeling out, is like, well, how much do data science and IO people actually talk to each other? Like, how much is there conversation going on there, so that when I get a message from the IO group, that I can trust that what they're saying actually happened in the product, and wasn't just like a wish list item that never made it in. So I think that, again, it comes down to this translation question of understanding where everybody in this equation is coming from and what their values are, and trying to approach it from that perspective to say, I understand that for you as an engineer, that you want there just to be an answer to this problem, but it's okay if there's not. We have to just progressively work toward it. And that's part of the process. And if they balk at that, then that suggests that, well, maybe they're not really thinking with the subtlety here that is important. And we've seen some pretty bad consequences to that. Not so much yet in the assessment space, at least not like publicly known, but we've seen situations in like a high profile example of that was predictive policing, where when you use input data sets that contain people who get arrested, which tends to be racially biased, for many reasons that have nothing to do with like the actual quality of that data set, or the quality of the information you're getting out of that data set, then you're going to end up with biased and problematic results at the other side. But in that situation, there were many engineers saying, well, that's just the best data set we had available, so that's what we used. No problem. That's just what we have. Whereas we, from the more human psych perspective, would say, well, wait, we need to take a step back and really reconceptualize what we're trying to do here and why. And make sure that's actually aligned with our goals. So anytime, and this is why I keep going back to values, like it's always about what people are bringing conceptually, almost philosophically, to these discussions. And you have to understand that to even have a meaningful conversation, and make sure that you're all on the same page. I don't think there's any way around it, to be honest.
Sure. Yeah, I remember the running joke in grad school is the answer to everything from a psychologist is it depends. And that is a very different way of looking at things from how an engineer might view the world. So, interesting to think about, kind of like you said, the philosophical differences just based on the way we were trained. I think we have time for one more question. So one person asked, what skills should IOs be focusing on that won't become redundant with AI like ChatGPT?
Yeah, that's a fun question. So, there's a couple of different ways to approach it. So, with my own students, I've recommended to think about it in two different ways. One is, how can we understand AI as potentially providing a toolkit and framework that we can take advantage of? And then on the other side, how can we think of AI as actually fundamentally changing and affecting the subject of our work? So if, for example, you're in an assessment space, you might start to think, well, wait a minute, what happens if all of the employees of this company start using AI in like AI teamwork situations? How would that affect what we're doing with that company? That's a question that we're going to have to start to grapple with. The other side being the personal part. There's some really, really broad opinions now on exactly what the role should be of AI and more advanced AI, newer tools right now. So what I told my students when we had this conversation, my grad students, is that I think it is, frankly, at this point, if you're doing for example, a literature review, like if in an organization, the example I used with them was, if you were just asked, hey, you need to go do a gender climate survey in this organization and understand current gender climate issues here, and you've never studied gender climate before, but you're, let's say an internal consultant working inside of a big company, and you're the IO that's responsible for this, then what do you do in that situation? And I said, I think it's at this point irresponsible to not consult like a ChatGPT 4 as a first general pass on that. Because what GPT does is essentially looks for a consensus prediction from the internet. It's like, I think of it almost like a super highly precise and very powerful search engine. So search engines can still lead you down very wrong paths, and they can still give you all sorts of poor answers, but it's an important part of understanding the space. So I told them, I think it's irresponsible if you don't at least check to say, all right, let's see where the internet has consensus on what to do in this situation. And then I will then follow it up using my own personal research skills to try to figure out, well, is that right? Where should I go further? Where should I go deeper? Maybe I consult with GPT again to get more information. Maybe I don't. Maybe I abandon that path and go back to Google Scholar or PsycInfo or whatever to get more information. And I use that simply as one more tool in my toolkit to get to a good, high quality engineered solution to a problem as quickly, as efficiently, and as accurately as I can. I don't know how mainstream of a view that is at this point, but I'm of the opinion that the progression of AI and also the improvement and the quality of these tools is inevitable. Like, this is just going to keep building, and it's going to keep building faster. And anybody that doesn't get on board is going to get left behind. One of the examples I heard recently, I don't remember who said it, but the thought was, it was talking about the legal profession, and to say, it's not that lawyers will be replaced with AI, it's that the lawyers who use AI will replace the lawyers who don't. And I think that setup is the same here. That if we don't accept that these tools exist and that they do provide value and find the ways to use them, then that's just going to create space in the market. Not only for the IOs that do that, but also for this broader consultant sphere of people who have less expertise. It's going to allow them to take over because they can kind of work around and work to solutions faster, even with less training. And that's very dangerous. That's a future of consulting that I don't like the look of. So I think that we, as experts in human behavior and how this operates in organizations, have a responsibility to figure out how to take advantage of them. And if we don't, that's the problem. We need to be in the front of it.
Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me of, a job analysis that I did once where, when I talked to the management, they were talking about the benefits of automation and how it was going to help free up people's time and they were going to be able to focus on more complex tasks. And it was, all about how it was going to help with efficiency, help employees. But when I talked to the employees about it, they were panicked and they thought, oh, it's going to take my job. I'm going to become, I'm not going to be needed anymore. So it kind of reminds me of that, that difference in thinking of like not thinking about how AI, what is it going to take over for me? Because there's some things, like syntax generation and data cleaning that, yeah, please, okay, I gladly use, AI to do things like that, to free up our time to focus on other things, and how can I, have a deeper understanding of other things that, you really need, human and intuition for.
So I think anybody that has tried GPT-4 and has used it in this kind of professional sense, it is astonishing what it is capable of. And I think the intuition is to assume that, oh, this will replace the more rote tasks. But one of the things that I did just as an experiment was basically say, part of the writing process for me is I make outlines. And I said, oh, what if I just give my topic sentences to GPT and say, hey, what would a paragraph in an academic paper look like with citations on the basis of this argument? And sometimes it provided stuff that I had read already, and sometimes it didn't. But that provided more information for me to actually go on and build a stronger argument as I was going. So the complexity of these predictions is mind-boggling. If you haven't really looked at it, I think everybody should absolutely go take a look at GPT right now. Because it is capable of predicting things in ways that it's hard to even wrap your head around. It's like those old questions of, can you even imagine the size of the galaxy? And no, our human brains are not capable of it. We're in a similar situation here of exactly what can this thing do for us? We're just in the beginning. I mean, there are so many more directions this could go and so much advancement in front of us. I mean, we are right in the beginning of this. And it's going to be very exciting to see all the potential and all the power and neat stuff we can do as the tools mature, one, but two, as our ability to use the tools matures. It's a very exciting time.
Yes, absolutely. Very exciting times. Definitely looking forward to see where things go, where things progress. And, just, thank you so much for your time. This has been really eye-opening, really helpful. Hopefully everyone got a lot out of it. And hopefully we will see you at PsyUp coming up.
Sounds great.